In this presentation, we will be covering the case of the Central Park Five.
Okay, to start, some background about the case. The Central Park Five involved 5 young boys, which included Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise, who was the oldest. The boys were originally brought in for unlawful assembly, but upon arrival, they were accused of the crime, and all 5 were interrogated for hours without their parents present, and these interrogations were not recorded. Also, the boys confessed on videotapes, but later recanted these confessions.
So the genesis, or kind of the events that led up to the Central Park 5 case, or what was going on at this time, there was a large number of civil rights movements going on. And then in New York specifically, in 1988, there was the Tompkins Square Park riot, which had to do with the very high rates of homeless individuals in the park, and there was just, the police ended up putting in a curfew, and there was a big riot, and it definitely made the police department look really bad, and a lot of people were hating on them. Another big thing was that in 1989 in New York, the crime rate was one of the highest it's been. So there was a big pressure on the police department to be solving these cases. Another thing too is that in the media, the minorities tend to be stereotyped because of high crime rates. So there was definitely biases against them. Also, just because of the high crime rate, there was short staffing, and sometimes there was individuals being hired on that just weren't really fit to be cops.
Next, we will be applying investigative psychology to the case of the Central Park Five. Investigative psychology is the analysis of the crime scene, investigation, and forensics.
Important part about the psychology of the Central Park case are the confession tapes of the young males. Antron McCray's confession was very interesting to hear. He starts by talking about how him and his friends went to the park and eventually ended up committing a crime. Antron doesn't go into heavy detail about what he exactly was doing in the park that night. The main point he kept bringing up in his story was about a tall, thin black man. According to McCray's confession, this tall, thin black man was the head of committing the crime, while himself and a few of the kids were there just to assist in the crime. Antron doesn't admit to harming her, but he said that he helped with holding her down as the others raped and beat her. Overall, his storyline was very vague, and he had a hard time recalling the events and those who were there with him. He seemed to be very on edge and uneasy and unconfident in his own answers, which is very easy to tell through his body language. He had repeated behaviors such as rocking back and forth. He constantly was licking his lips. Oftentimes he would stutter through his answers, use filler words, or mumble to the point in which you can't really hear exactly what he is saying. Even in his own answers, he would state that he didn't know what exactly happened, whether he didn't see who did it, or he didn't know what exactly occurred after that because maybe it was too dark, or blaming it on some other things like that, or he didn't know who was there with him. He tended to be very agreeable, though, with the names or storyline that were given to him from the person behind the camera. The key points I just want to bring up is that overall, during his interview or his confession, he seemed uneasy, and he tries to rush through the confession tape. He is more agreeable to the suggestions that were made by the person behind the camera, and he is often unsure of the events that occurred. And typically, he liked to generalize the story and give very vague information.
Next up is the confession tape of Kevin Richardson. First up is his body language. The tape provided makes it difficult to analyze Kevin's body language because of the poor quality. We can take note of a few things, however. His excessive blinking and the hiding of his hands. There were also a few inconsistencies within his story. When the interviewer asked Kevin if he saw a weapon used, he became confused. The interviewer tells him that something other than a human fist was used in the attack, and that this was proved by the medical examination, but Kevin tells her that he saw nothing. He also claims that Yusuf was present, but he later left sometime. He was unable to tell the interviewer when he left and how much involvement that he had in the attack. A few key points within his story. Kevin claims that he did not participate in the rape or beating and even tried to help the victim, and that was how he acquired a scratch on his face. He claims that Antron was laughing and he was the first to rape the victim. Mike Frisco then beat her, then Raymond raped her, and then Steve Lopez raped her. Finally, he claimed that Antron, Raymond, Mike, and now Corey Wise moved the body. Next is Yusuf Salam. Yusuf was the only one to not self-incriminate. In other words, he did not do a confession. He did, however, have a psychological evaluation done, and this evaluation showed that he was obedient to authority, he had a strong sense of right and wrong, and a psychologist diagnosed him with identity disorder and stated that this disorder could potentially affect his ability to make a voluntary statement. He was also found to have a high IQ score of 110.
Now we move on to the interview or confession of Raymond Santana. Just some basic things at the beginning was that he was read his rights and his father was present during his confession. So some key things to know about his body language is that at the beginning of the confession, he is slouched in his chair and his arms are crossed, and he just, throughout the interview, appears really tired and spacey. When the interview is being conducted, and at the beginning, the interviewer makes a point of telling him to sit up and that he needs to respond verbally to questions because he tries to just nod his head to a lot of things and not actually speak. He is moving in his chair back and forth pretty much the whole interview, and he is looking down a lot and doesn't really make good eye contact. His confession, he doesn't really seem to know a lot of the guys that he's talking about. A few he appears to by using last names, but other ones it's just like he's reading off names. He doesn't really appear to know them at all. Every time he mentions Kevin, the interviewer always makes a point of adding Richardson at the end, seemingly highlighting that. Also, Stephen Lopez was really present in his confession and involved in the whole assault and rape of the victim.
Okay, next we will discuss Corey Wise's statements. He was the only boy who had 2 confessions. His second statement occurred about an hour and a half after his first statement, and Wise was the one to initiate the second statement because he said that his first statement was not the truth. So throughout both of his statements, he was very anxious, and his body language proves this. He was continuously shaking his legs in the videos as well as blinking rapidly. He also kept his hands hidden and his fingers interlocked through the confessions. Moreover, during his answers, he did not answer confidently. He frequently stuttered and used a lot of filler words and I don't know answers. Another noteworthy point is the inconsistencies between his statements. Corey kept changing who and in what order the jogger was raped. At first, he said that only Steve raped the victim, but later he claims that Steve, Kemen, and Raymond all raped her. He also said that Steve cut the victim's shirt, but in the picture the interviewer showed, the victim's shirt was not cut. And finally, Corey said that it was too dark to see, but then proceeded to answer questions about the victim's body position, the spot of her injuries, and whether or not the victim was bleeding. And all of these would be pretty difficult to see in the dark. Some other key points. Wise went into specific details on certain things, but not on others. And the interviewer was almost forcing Corey to answer all of her questions, and his answers of "I don't know" were not enough. Now to go into some psychology behind the Central Park 5 case. A huge aspect of this case was the false confessions, because essentially the false confessions were the only evidence against the boys, and this is what sentenced them. All the boys, except Yusuf, gave what is known as a compliant false confession. A compliant false confession is when individuals are induced to falsely confess, typically to escape further interrogation. During these confessions, the suspect knows that they did not commit the crime, but the short-term benefits will outweigh the long-term costs. And this was the case of the boys because they believed that they would be released after they confessed. The boys just wanted to go home and get out of that situation. They had been without food for hours, and they believed they could go home and not get in trouble if they confessed because that is what they were told. Also, compliant false confessions tend to be recanted later, and this was the case for the boys. Certain factors make false confessions more likely. One of those factors is having a disability. Corey Wise had a learning disability that was said to be resulted from abuse. Also, the youth are more susceptible to giving false confessions because they are impulsive and they search for instant gratification. The youth also tend to waive their Miranda rights, and this is why they're more likely to falsely confess. Another psychological aspect involved in this case is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is essentially searching for information that agrees with your views or claims and ignoring all other information. And in the Central Park 5 case, the prosecution team focused only on the evidence that supported a guilty claim and ignored the leads and evidence that would have exonerated the boys.
Humans are chirotic, which means we have event-based memory. A person who is not lying is more concerned with getting the facts straight, so they will present the information by event, which means they typically will not give the story in chronological order always. However, if a person is using deception, they are more focused on persuading the listener than being accurate, so they will likely go in order of events along with going into great detail. The young boys' confessions were focused chronologically, along with going in depth with the details, which is a sign of deception. Kinesics is the study of non-linguistic movements, looking at gestures and facial expressions as a way of communication. All the boys showed some form of deceptive movement throughout their tapes. For most, they showed rapid blinking, moving around chairs, shaking their legs a lot, and some had interlocking hands throughout. The law of concentrated attention is the more we attend to an idea, the more likely it is that idea will be realized. It's kind of the idea of fake it till you make it. This means that a person will follow the suggestions and are only going through the motions with no real commitment. For boys doing the confession tapes, this law is seen as the person making the suggestions to them is constantly reminding them of the storyline to a point in which they start to commit to that as their story. So despite no evidence pointing to the boys, the jury still convicted them. You may ask yourself why. Well, their decision could be accredited to the fundamental attribution error. This is the idea that people look at themselves situationally and others dispositionally. We observe a person's behavior and we immediately draw the inference that the behavior reflects on the person. This applies to the jury. The jury watched somebody confessing, and they fully realize nobody confesses to a crime that he didn't commit. But they do not see the situational factors that the boys had to go through.